True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Susan McFarland, a hardworking mother of 3, disappeared just before Thanksgiving in 2002. 3 days later, her car was found in an abandoned parking lot with the keys still in the ignition. Her friends and family hoped that Sue had just gone off to have some time alone, but investigators became suspicious of foul play based on her husband's unusual behavior both before and after Sue's disappearance. Join us at the quiet end today for Gone From Home, The Disappearance of Susan McFarland. There's an interesting story here about the lives of a family under emotional and financial distress and 3 young children who lost the only stable parent they had.
Texas case, Texas beer, right?
Yes, another Texas case.
So we're going to do Christmas Ale, because it is the season, from St. Arnold Brewing Company in Houston. This is an English old ale. I like these guys, old ales, and St. Arnold. So this is a reddish-brown color beer with an off-white head. Pretty nice-looking beer. An aroma of sweet malt and spice, which translates into caramel, a little molasses, some cinnamon, and some clove. A very good beer. Medium-bodied, easy to drink. One of those seasonal beers.
A nice toasty New Year's Eve beer to have.
You got it.
Yep. So let's take down those Christmas trees and get out the party favors.
Okay, because that's what we're doing at the quiet end. You notice the tree's gone? No more Santas?
Yeah, there's all this build-up for Christmas, and then it's a bit of a letdown after.
Well...
Because it can never live up to the Hallmark movies or anything.
Well, I don't know about living up to something. It just happens and comes and goes too quickly.
Yeah, that's true. Very true. All right, so let's start our conversation about Susan McFarland.
Okay, I'll lead off, huh?
Sure.
So Huck and Mary Elizabeth Smith had 3 children. They were 15, 13, and 11, and then their youngest daughter, Susan, was born. She was born on New Year's Eve in 1958. Now, because she was born when her mom was 40 and her dad was 48, and there's like 11 years between the 3rd and the 4th child, Susan was often teased that she was an accident. Now, her response was, "I was a bonus." Now, Huck was an FBI agent, and he had received a letter of congratulations for the birth of his daughter, Susan, that was signed by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. As an adult, Susan kept the framed letter on a wall in her home.
Yeah, she grew up in Missouri, where her older sister Ann was responsible for babysitting her quite a bit. But as Sue got older, Ann decided it was fun to hang out with her baby sister. She was an easygoing child and very affectionate with her family. So Ann sometimes took Sue along with her even on her dates, and it wasn't a problem. At least not for Ann.
Boy, I don't know.
Maybe the guys didn't like it, but...
I'm thinking maybe one time okay. Second time, that's our last date.
Yeah. Well, after Ann moved away for college, she frequently had Sue come visit her on the weekends. The other students at her school loved Sue. She was like everyone's little sister. Sue's big brother Harley had a daughter named Kristen when Sue was just 5 years old. And when Kristen stayed with her grandparents, they paid Sue to keep her busy. But as they got older, the age difference really diminished, and Sue became good friends with her niece, Kristen. Sue met her best friend when she was 13 years old, Sandy Rowe. Sandy and Sue were inseparable, spending time hanging out at a local bakery and attending high school classes together. Sue worked as a lifeguard at a hotel swimming pool in the summers, and Sandy would sit by the pool with her and play cards when the pool wasn't busy. So Sue was just an upbeat, energetic type of person. She was always busy doing something fun or planning something fun. One thing the girls loved to do was to shop. They could shop for hours and not even spend much money. They also liked to go to the movies. Sue played tennis, but Sandy never got good at the sport, even though she tried. Sue was a really busy kid. She ice skated, she was a hockey cheerleader, and she also served on the student council, the pep club, and the French club. She was also a really big reader, sometimes reading 1 or 2 novels a week, even during the school year.
But Sue was human, after all, and certainly far from perfect, especially as a teen. She could be rebellious. She sometimes would skip class or went home for lunch and just didn't bother returning to school after lunch. But she got away with a lot, because she was talented at making up elaborate excuses that her teachers and parents usually believed. So Sue and Sandy graduated high school together in 1977. Sue then went to a private girls' college in Fulton, Missouri. Sandy stayed in St. Louis and went to Washington University. So they were less than 2 hours apart, so they were able to visit each other pretty often.
Yeah, but when Sue announced she was majoring in accounting, her friends were pretty surprised. She seemed too fun to be a serious number-crunching office person. But Sue really enjoyed accounting. She was fun and adventurous, but she also was very disciplined and organized. Also, she really admired her dad, who had an accounting degree. So after graduating in the top of her class, Sue took a position with Santa Fe Energy in Amarillo, Texas. While she was working there, she got her CPA, and the next summer she traveled to St. Louis to be Sandy's maid of honor. Sandy's marriage would last only 4 years, but Sue would always be there to listen to her and give her advice.
Then Sue took a second job after working for a while with Santa Fe Energy, and she moved to Midland, Texas, and had a position with Enron.
Yes, a notorious company, but at the time it was well respected. It was a good company.
Yeah, this is before they had their slippery slide.
Yes.
Now, after 6 months of working with Enron, she was transferred to their headquarters in Houston. And in Houston, Sue spent a lot of time with her former sister-in-law, Debbie. Now, Debbie had been married and divorced Sue's older brother, Pete. Sue would go to her nephew's soccer games, and she would shop with Debbie on the weekends. She loved to shop for clothing, and she dressed nicely. So she set up an exchange with her friends in Amarillo so that they all quadrupled their wardrobes by sharing.
So in 1987, Sue took a position with Southwestern Bell Corporation in St. Louis. Her position and the people she worked among there led her into a more glamorous life. She started attending charity events, dinner parties, and gallery openings. And she was happy to be back living near her friend Sandy. They began spending more and more time together, having lunch, taking aerobics classes, which was a big thing at the time. She was also reunited with her niece Kristen during this time. They were only a few years apart and became good friends. So they went out on the weekend nights, and Sue was happy to pay Kristen's way because Sue made a good salary and Kristen was still struggling. But as Sue got close to 30, she began to worry about finding a partner and having a family. She told a friend she wanted to have kids, and she'd like to stay home and raise them while a loving husband would work to support them, and they'd live in a nice suburban house. And then she met Rick McFarland, and he seemed to fit the bill of the kind of guy she wanted.
At least to begin with.
Yeah.
So Rick was the second son of Dick and Mona McFarland of Kirkwood, Missouri. When he was a young kid, the family moved to St. Louis. He grew up in Webster Groves with his 2 brothers, David and Don. In high school, he was a big water polo player, and he worked on the staff of the school newspaper. He went to Southwest Missouri State University in Springfield after high school, but had difficulty concentrating. So while he was there, he was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder and put on medication. And with the meds, he was able to maintain a B average. So he graduated with a bachelor's degree in business administration and got a job with a stock brokerage company, Shearson Lehman. Now, he did pretty well there. Drove a Beamer, had a carriage house, lived in an upscale part of town.
Right, so from just hearing that, you'd say, oh, this is a pretty great guy.
Well, why would you? Just because he's got a BMW? Come on.
Well, he seems like a good prospect.
He's got a job.
Right.
And he's haven't heard anything that says he's a jerk.
Right. That's what I'm saying. But, like everybody else, he did have issues. But he was pretty good at hiding them from most people. He did get in trouble one time in college for stealing, but the charges were dismissed. One of his former dates said that Rick made her very uncomfortable after they had 2 dates. Because she told him she didn't want to see him anymore, but he persisted calling her to the point where she was afraid of him. And then she caught him hiding in the bushes outside of her house, stalking her.
Now that would be a concern.
Yes, but of course Sue doesn't know about any of this.
Right.
And Sue and Rick had actually attended the same high school, but they didn't really meet each other until they bumped into each other at a party in St. Louis. Rick was much quieter than Sue, so they seemed like kind of an unlikely couple when they began dating. But to Sue, she felt like she hit it off with him.
Again, not to demean Sue, but we've already talked about how she's hitting 30, and she's thinking like time is running out. So maybe she settled for something not quite the top of her list.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people close to her actually thought.
But, he would do in a pinch.
Well, I don't know if I'd go that far, but I guess she didn't seem like she was head over heels like he was, her Prince Charming, but she thought he would do.
He would do.
I mean, he seemed like a nice, stable guy, but he wasn't nearly as clever or witty as Sue. Sue was really fun. But, Rick seemed like he could be a good match for her. She could be the outgoing one, and he could keep her grounded. But still, Sandy and Kristen thought that Sue probably was settling a bit with Rick, just because she wanted to start a family, and she was getting older.
See?
Yes, you're very right.
So Sue would be the take charge one in this relationship. They both enjoyed parties. They liked to spend time with friends. And Sue just loved to plan get-togethers with her friends in their social circle. Rick, though, was much more reserved and actually socially awkward, but he did enjoy socializing. So he seemed like a good choice for a husband, at least to Sue.
Yeah, I mean, nobody was dramatically opposed to him in Sue's world. And they spent their first 4th of July weekend in Amarillo with some of Sue's friends. Her friends thought Rick seemed nice enough, but they really doubted that Sue was madly in love. Still, she was excited to be in a serious relationship and planning to start, a new part of her life, having a family.
That's right. This is the next stage.
Yeah, and she's done everything by the book. She's doing the right things here.
I'm going to get married, going to have kids.
She's got her college degree, her CPA. Yeah. So later that summer, Sue and Rick were engaged. And just days before their wedding, Sue called her sister Anne to tell her that Rick had changed jobs. And she was upset about this and having some doubts because he had switched jobs 3 weeks before he even mentioned it to her. So that was a bit of a red flag, and she did notice it.
There's another one of those red flags, huh?
Yeah.
Geez, honey, I forgot to tell you. I quit my job 3 weeks ago.
But he did start another one. So it's not necessarily a deal breaker. At least for Sue it wasn't, and I could see it.
I suppose not, but, if I did that, well, I'd tell you to begin with, but, it just seems like something you'd mention to your spouse or your future spouse.
Oh, sure. It would be upsetting, but I just don't know if it would make me cancel the wedding.
Right.
I mean, sometimes things happen. He's not perfect. Okay.
Yeah, but that seems pretty simple to do.
It certainly does. I mean,
mention to your fiancé what's going on.
Well, there's a reason why you don't, right? You're embarrassed or you're hiding something. It's definitely a sign that everything's not on the up and up. But if you told it to her the right way and apologized, I could see how that would be something you'd just let go and move forward.
Oh, sure.
And what's funny, though, is Rick's mom was the one who was opposed to the marriage.
Was she?
Yeah, you would think she'd be happy that he picked Sue, but no.
Yeah, well, she didn't think Sue was as serious as she would like. She saw Sue as pretty much of a party girl, and she just wasn't religious enough.
Now, Rick's family was very religious.
Well, if they're very religious, isn't anybody that's going to be religious enough?
Well, I don't know. There probably are some people that are. But, this gave Sue's mom some doubts, too, and the two mothers were introduced but didn't get along very well. Their backgrounds and their outlooks on life just didn't match up. So neither of them were super thrilled about the merging of these families because they didn't really get along. But despite all of these little bumps in the road, Sue and Rick were married in August of 1989. This was a big, expensive wedding. We're talking 8 bridesmaids and 400 guests. Huge.
Yeah, even in 1989 dollars, that would be a big ticket item.
Yeah, about the price of buying a house, probably.
Probably.
But Sue put this event together almost exclusively on her own. Her bridesmaids did help out, planning the bridal luncheon and the rehearsal dinner. But Rick didn't really help. Sue was the planner here.
Yeah, but she liked doing that.
Well, that's what guys always say. She might have liked a little more help. She might not have minded that.
Maybe. So Sue and Rick settled into a house in Olivet, Missouri. Shortly after that, Sue was shocked, to say the least, and upset to learn that Rick was deeply in debt. Another one of those things he forgot to mention to her before they married.
Yes.
And it was going to take years for the debt to be paid off.
And this to me is worse than the job change.
Oh, by far.
Because this is affecting her life. Once you get married, that person's debt is yours.
And, it's one thing to excuse kind of maybe an overlook of the job stuff.
Right.
But how can you got to talk about debt or finances.
Well, yes, you should.
Not. Anyway.
Right.
So Sue continues to work pretty hard as a CPA, and she gets promoted around December. And around the same time, Rick changed jobs. Again, he does that a lot. Now he was working as a real estate investment person in a firm called Paragon Realty. That job didn't last very long either. So within a few months, he moved into insurance sales at Aetna.
Yeah, and this is something he could do from home. Well, while working in investments and insurance, Rick contacted family members to get access to their coworkers. Sue's sister Ann told him it was inappropriate to show up at their workplaces and go up to their coworkers and make sales pitches. It was embarrassing. But he continued to show up, like he was oblivious to how inappropriate this was and how unwanted it was.
Well, he's got a job to do.
Yeah, but he was really going beyond where he should have been.
Yeah.
It was very inappropriate.
He was overstepping his boundaries.
Yeah, and it's not like he was making sales. He was just embarrassing himself and his friends and family.
Yeah.
That's why it takes a special person to be a salesperson and not be that annoying person. It's
tough one to do.
Yeah, it's a thin line. So in March of 1991, Rick and Sue had their first child. And Sue hoped that having a baby would improve her relationship with her mother-in-law. Maybe it would help them to bond. But no such luck. Things actually got worse. Mona Macfarlane disapproved of Sue's going back to work. But Sue really had no choice. She was the main support of the family. What was she supposed to do?
That's right. Well, she could have ratted her husband out to her mother-in-law.
Yeah, but that's not the type of person she was, right?
Well, and it wouldn't help anyway.
She never said anything to anyone about Rick's inability to hold a job long-term, except maybe her closest girlfriends. She just persevered. She smiled at Mona and took the beating that she didn't deserve, right?
That's right.
Because she had to go out to work. And she would have loved to have stayed home with her kids. Just wasn't an option.
Well, that was the dream back in the day.
Right, and she'd worked hard, and, I think she deserved that, at least for a few years.
I want to get married, have children, and stay at home with my kids.
Yeah, well, that didn't happen.
No. Now, Rick and Sue were pretty delighted with their son. They once took him on vacation to Cape Cod with Kristen and her boyfriend. And Sue seems like a natural at motherhood. And the baby, the little boy, was a very content little kid. Sue would take him everywhere, even into nice restaurants, and he just behaved. Yeah,
she was described as one of those kind of effortless mothers that can just put a baby on their hip and continue life as it was with no problem. The kind of women that a lot of us really envy. But just months later, Rick lost his job again. He was unemployed for 15 months this time, so this was a strain. And finally, Sue helped him get a job with her company as a telemarketing salesman. So that shows a little bit of desperation that she needed to do that.
Yeah, it seems like she would take any job he could get, right?
Yeah, and she's pretty much an executive,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, he's been looking, or maybe not looking. He's been unemployed. I don't know how hard he was looking for 15 months. Got to get some money from him coming in.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it's not like we would judge a person on how much money they can make, but just make an effort to contribute is all I would say.
Right.
But at this new job, Rick was seen as a bit of a weirdo. He worked in a cubicle with the other telemarketers, but when the boss was out of the office, Rick moved his stuff into this big conference room, and he met there with clients. He even started calling the conference room his office, and he would pretend to be in charge of the office in front of these clients.
Sue and Rick shared a driveway with their next-door neighbors. That was Margo and Doug Cromack. Sue and Rick both had Beamers that they parked there. So even though he's not making diddly, still got to have his BMW, right?
I think he was that kind of a guy, yeah.
Sue's BMW is a bright orange one. Now when Margo, her next-door neighbor, was pregnant with her first child, Sue became pregnant with her second, and this turned out to be another boy. The two women spent a lot of time together, and Margo was impressed with Sue's energy, because in addition to her full-time professional job and the responsibilities of motherhood, Sue was in a cooking club and a book club. And to Margo, Sue seemed to be one of the happiest, most together women she knew. Two families shared children's birthday parties, cookouts, and holidays. Sue even painted Margo's children's bedroom, and Margo planted roses in the Macfarlane's yard.
Yeah, so pretty close.
Good peeps.
Yeah, it's a good neighborhood situation, right? It's good
Right.
to have neighbors like that. Sue and Margo would take their kids to the St. Louis Zoo often in the afternoons to tire them out for bedtime. Margo's husband, Doug, was a medical resident who wasn't home very much. But Rick kicked in and really helped out. He took the Cromack boy along with his two sons outside when he did lawn maintenance and taught them about sports, stuff like that. Like he'd be mowing the lawn and then the little boys would follow with their bubble mowers. So he seemed like an okay dad.
He's willing to play with kids. That's a good deal.
Yeah.
So things seem to be going along fine, at least from the periphery. But then in 1993, in July, Rick lost his job again. Now he came home and he told Sue that he had been fired unfairly. He said he was just days away from a 1-year mark, and in that case he would have been eligible for union support. So Sue took him at his word when he said this. She was angry for him, and she called her sister Ann, who happened to be an attorney. So Ann told Sue she should look into what happened before doing anything litigious. Sue was an executive there, and she didn't want to put her own job on the line.
Yeah, so Sue did do some investigation, and she found out that 2 employees had asked for transfers because they didn't want to work with Rick. 2 other employees had gone to management, and they'd threatened to quit if Rick was not fired. Also, after firing Rick, his supervisor was afraid of him because Rick reacted with rage. So the supervisor requested an escort to and from her car for months after that. So when Sue heard that, I mean, she's an executive there. I imagine it was embarrassing and upsetting. And of course, then he couldn't get unemployment.
No kidding. Not like that. And she's thinking, she's going to bat for him, and she's finding out that he's pretty much lied to her again.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I really sympathize with this.
So this time he was out of a job for just a couple months. So that's better than the 15 months anyway.
Yeah.
Then he got another telemarketing position. He worked for a company selling dining cards. And one day he came home in a nice new Mercedes, and he told Sue his new boss had given the car to him. Sue kind of got worried, right? That's an unlikely story.
Yeah, she really didn't believe it.
No, and she never got a real explanation. But whatever, the car was returned by Rick a few days later, so they didn't keep it.
Yeah. And their second son was born in September of 93, and then they decided to try again in 96 because Sue wanted a daughter. But she did have a miscarriage, and she finally gave birth to a third son in March of 97. She was still happy with the baby, of course. I mean, she wanted a daughter, but she's still going to love a son. And she considered her family complete. That was it. No more kids. Then in 1998, Sue was again promoted at Southwestern Bell. She kept that position for 4 years, but then things at that company were getting a little shaky. There was a planned consolidation of Southwestern with Pac Bell, and that could have meant the end of her position. The McFarland's neighbors, the Cromacks, had moved to San Antonio a year earlier, so Sue and Rick took their boys to visit, and they decided they really liked the city. The Cromacks showed them around, and Sue was excited about the prospect of a fresh start in a new city. Maybe things will get better between her and Rick if they get a fresh start, she thought.
Well, sure. Why not?
Well, the problem about that is wherever he goes, he's there.
Well, yeah. I think I'd be more excited about the prospect of a fresh start if I was going there without my husband.
Yeah, I don't think she was at that point yet. I think
this particular husband.
Well, sure, but I think at this point she still wanted to have a family intact.
Oh, sure. I'm just being a jerk.
Yeah, well, I wasn't going to say that. So Southwestern Bell had moved their corporate headquarters to San Antonio. And after the McFarlands returned home, Sue applied for a position there and was called in for an interview. She got the job, and Rick even got a job offer from San Antonio Transportation selling ad space for city buses.
So while their Missouri house was on the market, Sue stayed there. And Rick went ahead to work in San Antonio, and he ended up staying with the Cromacks for a few weeks. Now Margo and Doug noticed some things a little bit strange about Rick. He often stayed up all night and slept during the day. Not terribly strange, but a lot of times when he did sleep, he just crashed on top of his bed fully dressed.
Well, I think it's kind of strange if you're staying in someone's house and you're up walking around in the night.
Yeah?
That might make them feel uncomfortable.
Well, it would me.
Yeah. But Sue supervised the move, and she cared for the 3 boys, and she even wrote encouraging letters to her husband. She wrote to him that she believed in him, and she knew he would be a big success in San Antonio. Then when Sue and her boys moved to San Antonio, she began her new position as an industry market revenue analyst. And this was a position with big responsibility and an even bigger salary.
Just continuing to move up.
Yes.
Now in San Antonio, the McFarland's new home had this big open floor plan, perfect for parties. They were in a nice neighborhood just a few miles from downtown. Good schools, trendy businesses, nice place, up and coming.
Yeah, so settled into a middle-class community with other young families, Sue and her boys were well-liked. But some of Rick's odd behavior was off-putting to the neighbors. The first incident happened right after they moved in. The family in the house behind them were away for the weekend, and they came home to find their hackberry tree was missing. And there was a fresh stump where the tree had been. So at first the Millers thought that the city had cut down their tree to work on power lines. But Mr. Miller called the city, and they denied having anything to do with it. So Rick was in the yard with his boys, and Mr. Miller walked over to the back fence and introduced himself. After making some small talk, Mr. Miller asked Rick if he had seen his tree, which had been there on Friday when they left. And Rick just shrugged and said no, until Miller asked him outright if he had cut down the tree. And Rick admitted that he had cut down their tree. He said he'd done it because the tree was dropping too many leaves into his yard. So Miller told Rick, you can't just go into someone else's yard and cut down their tree. This is Texas. You're going to get yourself shot.
Yeah.
But Rick didn't seem really to care. He didn't apologize. He did say that he would make it up to Miller, so he promised to create a website for Miller's business. Miller thought that was weird, but he decided that, Rick's a bit off, okay. So he kind of forgot about the offer until 2 weeks later, Rick calls him up, and Rick told him he was finished with his website and it would cost him $2,500. Miller said he thought the offer was to do it for free to make up for taking down his tree, so he refused to pay and told Rick just forget it. But Rick persisted and tried to get the money out of him. He even told him he'd already registered the domain name, so he had to pay for it. And Miller said, no way, just leave me alone.
Yeah, well, but the way that goes down, he admits to cutting down the tree and says, I'm going to make it up to you. I'm going to design your website. No mention of money or anything.
Well, sure.
And now there is.
Yeah, it's just, he just makes me think he's like this shady guy, right? He's kind of a con man.
It sounds like it. So Miller passed along his story to a friend, and when this friend heard Rick's name, he recognized it. He told Miller that Rick McFarland was a crook. because he had tried to sell a bus ad to this guy, but he had declined. Then a few days later, McFarlane's boss called, and he thanked this guy for a major advertising contract. But he hadn't done that. He hadn't signed up. Turned out that Rick had forged the name of the contract.
Yeah, so he'd forged this guy's signature who had turned him down. And that's how he'd started off his sales job, so Rick lost another job. Next, he moved on to Clear Blue Media, internet advertising sales, for a few months, and then he moved on to stay home, working on self-employment schemes and caring for his 3 sons. So kind of a bitter disappointment for Sue. But, she tried to make the best of it. Well, at least he's home with the kids.
Okay.
But after that hackberry tree incident, neighbors had another issue with the McFarland's dog, Sally. Sally had this small graveled area she stayed in when she wasn't playing in the main yard with the boys. But she was unhappy out there when she was left out there, and she would bark incessantly. Mr. Miller approached Rick and asked if he had heard a dog barking at night, and Rick said no. Then another neighbor who was concerned about Sally asked Rick why he never let her into the house. Rick said that Sally had chewed on a rug and that his wife Sue had been unhappy about it. So the neighbor suggested, well, get her a toy to chew on. But Rick said that would only teach her to chew more. But the neighbor knew he was lying. He was just full of it. Whenever he was out of town, Sue kept Sally in the house with her every night. Sue really loved that dog and had even given her the name that she'd been saving for her daughter, if she'd ever had one.
Yeah, and even though Rick and Steve Miller didn't get along, Sue and Carrie Miller, Steve's wife, did become quite close. Carrie's son would play with the McFarlane boys frequently. But Carrie wasn't comfortable letting her son play at the McFarlane house when Sue wasn't there. So when it was just Rick, he gave her the creeps. And when alone with their dad, the McFarlane boys were more out of control and needed more supervision. And then when they were with their mom, Sue, they were like different kids, polite and calmer. Then in 1999, Rick became involved with Promise Keepers, an organization promoting fatherhood and traditional marriage based on biblical values. He attended the San Antonio Men's Conference at the Alamo Dome. Thousands of men in attendance. They shared messages of salvation, holiness, family unity, and discipline. Now, many organizations had accused Promise Keepers as sexist and promoting male supremacy. Rick, however, said he just simply wanted to be a better man. If you go to the website, it says, masculinity is in crisis. The soul of men is at stake. Well, maybe that's just a tiny bit misogynistic.
Yeah, it's pretty sickening, really.
Well, this Promise Keepers is one of those bullshit organizations.
Well, I really wasn't sure until I looked it up, and I wasn't super happy with it. But, Sue's female friends, for the most part, just saw him as this awkward nerd, not really bad. They thought he liked to stay at home and play with his computer while Sue went out and worked. And the husbands of her friends just weren't fond of him, because he would spend hours talking about Pokemon cards or other things like nonsense. And he would act like a computer expert, but then it turned out he really didn't know as much as he wanted them to believe he did. So then in the year 2000, Sue's friend Sandy had some hard times. Her second child was born with Down syndrome and had to undergo heart surgery at 4 months of age. Just months later, Sandy was diagnosed with breast cancer, and Sue was there to support her through all this, including chemotherapy.
Boy, that's a double whammy, isn't it?
That was, yeah. Can you imagine? That's a hard year.
A newborn with Down syndrome and heart surgery. That's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got breast cancer.
Yeah.
Blah.
Yeah, tough. But, it was helpful for Sue to help her friend because it kind of took her mind off her own problems at home. She had been very frustrated that Rick was getting more out of control and she couldn't change his behavior. So that year she learned that Rick had held onto a phone that had been given to him by a previous employer, and that he had managed to charge thousands of dollars in calling fees on that phone. So she called up her sister Ann, the lawyer, after that incident, and she said that Rick had done another unethical thing that was going to cost her a fortune. And then she threatened that she would divorce him. So that's the first time her sister heard her mention the D word.
Yeah, it certainly seemed like things were heading that way.
Sure, yeah.
Now, then Rick also started to have physical issues. He had been to the ER several times because of severe headaches. Now, he told the doctor that he had been taking Adderall that was prescribed to his oldest son. He said he could concentrate better taking the Adderall. The ER doctor thought that the Adderall could be causing his headaches, and he told him he should see his own doctor, and he told him, stop taking your kid's meds.
Yeah. Well, plus, his son's got meds he's supposed to be taking that he's not getting.
No, he isn't.
So Sue's niece Kristen was married, and she got divorced by 2001. That was a short-lived marriage.
I guess.
She asked Sue about her marriage after Sue had shared her problems with Rick. But Sue said that she and Rick were going to work things out and be partners in raising their boys. She said it wasn't like a real marriage anymore, but more like a partnership. Kristen believed that that wouldn't last. She told Sue that she'd get to a point where she'd see a divorce as the best option for her and for the children. But at that point, Sue said that Rick would never let a divorce happen because his religion forbids divorce. So Sue and Rick went to marriage counseling in San Antonio. One of their problems was that Rick's parents didn't like or approve of Sue. Their criticisms were tough, but it was even worse because Rick refused to defend her. Another problem, of course, was Rick's employment instability. Sue had a very strong work ethic, and she was extremely frustrated that Rick was only working on home business schemes. He was a stay-at-home dad, and Sue was the one to pay the bills, and that's not how she wanted it. Plus, he really wasn't that helpful around the house.
No, he was just there.
Well, and also getting into trouble and costing her more money.
Yeah.
And embarrassment.
But it's not like he was cleaning the house and cooking the meals and doing the laundry.
No, I mean, I guess he did do some of that, but...
Minimal.
Yeah, pretty minimal from what I could imagine, yeah.
Now, Rick couldn't hold a job, and one of the reasons for that was that he had an image he wanted to project as a successful businessman. But he wasn't a good businessman, so it was tough to project that success, wasn't it?
It could be a problem.
He could have worked a job as a computer tech, but he insisted on working in sales. The difficulty there is he had a stutter, and he had poor social skills. So that makes it difficult to be working in sales. And, probably more importantly, he kind of lacked a little bit in the ethics department.
Maybe more than a little bit.
And this would keep getting him into trouble. So Sue is pretty embarrassed by much of this stuff, and she's getting tired of bailing him out. So after a bit, Rick next started an online business, Dotneta, D-O-T-N-E-T-A. And this is a company that paid cash to investors who held notes on car loans, life insurance, and real estate. In 2000 and 2001, he told Sue that he had earned about $20,000 per year. Now, this was a fraction of Sue's income, but she reported it as such on their tax returns. Now, she did admit to her sister she had no idea how he made any money at all, and she never saw any of it. Now, the boys are getting older, and they all have behavioral problems. So Sue took them to the doctors and to counseling sessions. They were all started on medication. Sue worried that their problems were related to Rick's inconsistent and poor child care, which is a true story, huh?
Yeah, it seems like it.
But she couldn't stay home with them because somebody had to be working to pay the bills. And if they're depending on Rick, they're going to starve.
It's a tough situation for her. I mean, really, how can you win in that situation?
You can't.
No, because the more she works, then she's accused of being a negligent mother. But she has to work to pay for things. And she's relying on him, and he's really not doing what he should be doing. Rick was making decisions about the boys' medications without consulting her or their doctor. He put them on a drug holiday while visiting his parents, and then complained about their behavior. So, as a pediatrician, if you had a father like this, what do? Can you report something like this to CPS at a certain point?
Sure.
You can.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the last resort, because once you go there, there's no turning back on that. But you sit down, you talk to them. This isn't medication prescribed for you. You can't take it. You don't make the decisions about when they don't take it. It's prescribed in this way that they should take it. And if it all comes down to it's not getting anywhere, then you say, I'm going to need to report you to Child Protective Services.
Well, yeah, because it's a form of negligence to not give them their medication.
It is. I mean, the analogy I would use is suppose your child had diabetes and you decided not to give him the insulin.
Well, yeah.
Same thing.
You're putting the child at risk either way.
You are.
Well, another thing Rick was well known for was forgetting to pick up the kids at school and at their activities. Sue was called at work more than once to pick them up when Rick failed to show up and didn't answer his phone. So she's at the office working, and she'd have to drop everything to go get the kids because Rick's doing God knows what. So you can imagine she's getting fed up.
Yeah. Well, and then he developed an obsession with shopping.
Yeah, and this was really weird.
This is, yes, very weird. So he'd be out shopping until late at night. Then he would oversleep, and the boys would be late for school because Mom had to go to work, and she wasn't responsible for getting them up. Or if they weren't late, he just kept the kids home all day.
He did that quite a bit.
So, and the house began to fill up with all the crap that Rick bought. If he thought something was a good deal, he'd buy a bunch of them. If there was a rebate, he'd send out for the rebate, and then he'd return the item to the store. So he got quite adept at figuring out time limits on returning items, and he would return them after using them or collecting the rebate.
Yeah, and Sue really tried to stop this scam. I mean, it often didn't work anyway, and their credit card would be billed, and they'd have to pay interest.
Yeah, but it's not an ethical practice.
Well, exactly. And he was sometimes out past midnight, stalking the aisles of Walmarts or Targets. And sometimes he'd even take the boys out late at night, and he'd just let them run wild in the store while he looked for what he wanted. So he's a really odd guy, right? And the kids would be out past their bedtimes, not get their homework done, just to buy some junk at Walmart that he could get a rebate in return, which you think his efforts could have been used in a more productive way.
So it would seem, right?
I mean, when Sue would come home after work, there was often a mess in the kitchen, shopping bags all over the place, homework not done, kids not bathed, just a disaster. So when she cleaned up the home office, she found a fanny pack filled with receipts. Then she found emails between Rick and Home Depot. The store complained that he was making way too many returns, or even returning things with holes in the packaging where they knew that he had removed the proof of purchase so he could send in for the rebate. And these returns are a violation of store policy, and really a violation of the law. That's not legal.
No, it's not.
It's stealing.
Then one day just before Christmas, Sue got home and found Rick out in the garage. He was exchanging the handlebars on some new scooters with the handlebars of their used scooters. Now, he told Sue this would cost him nothing because he planned to return the new scooters to the store with the old handlebars on them. I don't know what that scheme is about, but weird. When he went to the store to return them, the manager banned him forever returning to the store. Now, the boys were with him. They told Sue what had happened. So, of course, she's embarrassed, and she asked Rick to stop returning things with the kids. She had asked him to stop shopping and returning altogether. But he's not going to listen to that stuff. He's got a good scheme going here.
Well, what's he teaching his children here?
Dishonesty.
Yeah. So even though Rick is definitely deeply flawed as a parent, the boys' school thought he was a very involved father, and they liked him. He volunteered to help teachers in their classrooms. He also attended school meetings, plays, and Christmas pageants, stuff like that. So he stood out from all the other fathers because most of the other fathers were busy and weren't there very much. Their oldest son was at swim class when his coach noticed some small dark bruises on the boy's face. And the boy said that his dad had wanted to teach him a lesson when he wasn't paying attention at his tennis class. So Rick had hit tennis balls at the boy while making him stand motionless as he was hit with the balls. And this time the incident was reported to CPS. And the coach also called Sue to let her know. Sue denied that Rick could have done this at first, but eventually she just kind of broke down and admitted to the coach that she felt helpless. She felt powerless to make Rick take his medication for his obsessive-compulsive disorder, and she really didn't feel like she had any control on how he treated their 3 sons.
This is not a good state of affairs.
No, it's bad.
So when the coach told Sue, you need to get some help. And the coach also told Sue about behavior problems, which the boys showed whenever they were at swim practice with Rick. Now, Sue had never heard about these issues from Rick, and she told the coach that she relied on Rick as little as she possibly could, but there were times she needed him to take the kids to their activities while she was at work. She confided in the coach about how she couldn't keep a babysitter because none of the babysitters ever liked being around Rick. Sit a time or two and you're uncomfortable enough, I'm not going back there.
Oh, sure, I've been there.
She was worried about leaving him, though, because she didn't want him to get primary custody. Boy, she's sharing a lot with his swim coach, isn't she?
I think she really was looking for someone to talk to.
She had tried counseling, but Rick was non-compliant with any behavioral advice, and he was non-compliant with medications.
Well, and I'm sure that Sue was upset about the CPS thing.
Well,
I mean, that's like the worst thing that can happen as a mother, with your ability and the way you're taking care of your kids being raised as a question, and having a husband you can't rely on had to be very difficult.
No kidding.
Then after Rick heard about the call to CPS, he began to harass the swim coach, and she became concerned about her safety and asked the other parents to keep an eye on Rick when he was in the building. She also told her assistant coaches to be on the lookout for any bruises or injuries on his children. And Sue made an effort to try and show up at more of these practices herself.
Yeah, it turns out when the coach contacted Child Protective Services, she was upset to hear that the social worker had taken Sue's word for it that Rick was not abusive. So they didn't do much of an investigation.
No, I guess they contacted Sue, and she pretty much defended Rick.
Yeah, but that's not how it's supposed to be.
No, and that's why the coach was upset, because that shouldn't have happened.
Well, no, and neither should the fact that CPS told her the next time, call the police, not us.
I know, isn't that bad?
Who are these
people? They said they're just so busy, and the best thing to do is to call the police.
I know they're busy, but you don't want to hear that.
No, they shouldn't be that busy. They should hire more people, which would bring me to how we invest in our children in this country, and we could start a whole other conversation on that.
A very long conversation.
Absolutely. But you know, the swim coach wasn't the only one here who was getting more and more concerned. Neighbor Carrie Miller heard from the oldest McFarlane boy that his father had hit him with a baseball bat. Then neighbors also overheard Rick yelling at the boys when Sue was at work, calling them terrible names, the children crying and running out of the house. Just things are a disaster.
Fun place to live.
Yeah.
Now, in the fall of 2001, Sue's mother fell and broke her hip. And then she died in January of 2002, never having fully recovered. Sue's friend Sandy had survived her breast cancer, and she was very supportive of Sue after Sue's mother's death. So Sandy and her 4-year-old daughter went to San Antonio to spend a long weekend with Sue. Now, when she's there, she noticed there's a ton of tension between Sue and Rick. But then, when they're talking about this, Sue said, I'm committed to this marriage, at least until the boys are grown. Well, that's that other common story, We just get them out of high school into college, and then we can split.
Well, sure. That's easier said than done.
Well, it is. Plus, it doesn't help anything. I mean, you think it's better for the kids to be together as a couple, and it's not.
Not in this circumstance, that's for sure.
Not in pretty much all of them.
Yeah. Well, that March, Sue wrote to her sister Anne, telling her about her in-laws. They told Rick that Sue didn't make them feel welcome enough when they visited the house. They also told him that Sue didn't spend enough time with her kids and that she drank too much. So these are total non-drinkers, which is fine, but if Sue had 1 glass of wine at dinner, they decided she was an alcoholic. So that was very frustrating to her because she liked to have a glass of wine here and there. But despite her claims that she was going to stick it out with Rick, she did call a lawyer, and she asked some questions about community property laws. She wanted to be sure that her inheritance from her mother wouldn't have to be divided up if she got a divorce. But even with all this going on, Sue continued to take on more responsibilities. For nearly a month that summer, she served on a grand jury. An indictment had been handed down against Richard Clemmer, a man accused of stealing from elderly people by building up their trust and then taking advantage of them financially. And this guy ended up being convicted that autumn and got 2 years probation. So Sue knew of Clemmer beforehand. He owned a Texaco gas station near the McFarland's neighborhood, and after the grand jury indictment, she had warned her friends to avoid him, and she boycotted the business. But Rick didn't avoid Clemmer.
Now, in August of 2002, friends began to think that Rick was showing some deterioration in his mood and behavior. He had conversations that were rambling and made absolutely no sense, and he decided to shave his head, so he's bald. Neighbors also became more concerned about Sue. She seemed to be also emotionally beaten down and sad, and this is definitely not the old Sue. I mean, she's a dynamic, optimistic person. But now she seemed to lack self-confidence and had none of her usual energy.
Yeah, so by October, though, it seemed like Sue had a new resolve. She called up a friend and told her that she had inherited home furnishings and she wanted to have some help redecorating her house. When asked about what Rick thought, Sue said that he would no longer overrule her decisions. She was done with getting his input. In the meantime, Rick began to show an unusual interest in the sleeping arrangements of the next-door neighbors. He wanted to know which windows belonged to their bedrooms, and he repeatedly asked these questions. It seemed odd, to say the least, and the neighbors really didn't understand what he was getting at. Later, they'd believed that Rick had wanted to know where everyone would be so he could plan out the murder of his wife.
Maybe he's just a peeping Tom.
Well, you don't need to ask where their bedrooms are to do that.
Well, yeah, you need to know which bedroom's got the good-looking mom in there.
Oh, sure. I don't think that's what it was about, Dickie.
Okay.
But that would be creepy, too.
Probably more creepy.
More creepy than murdering his wife?
Well, at the time, all they know is that he's asking all these questions about where people sleep.
Right, right.
It wasn't until his wife disappeared
that they started having those thoughts.
Right.
Yeah. Well, the Cromacs were aware that Rick and Sue's relationship was hitting the rocks. Sue told Margo that she didn't know the man that she was living with anymore. The change had been gradual, but his speech was different, and it was hard to even have a simple conversation with him. As medical professionals, the Cromacs could see that Rick's mental health was really in decline, and they encouraged him to get medical help. But he wouldn't even engage in the topic. He was not going to talk about it at all.
In October, the McFarlane family visited Sue's former sister-in-law, Debbie, at a Southwest Texas University football game. They had a pizza dinner afterwards, and Sue made plans with Debbie to spend Thanksgiving together in San Antonio. On November 2nd, another friend of Sue's was entering the local Target store, and she saw Sue's 6-year-old son running out of the front doors. Now, she knew that Sue was at work, and she asked the kid who was in the store with him. And he said he was with his dad, but he didn't know where he was. So the woman took this child into the store with her, but didn't see Rick anywhere. Now, after asking a man to check the men's room, she finally found Rick in a checkout lane. She took his son to him and told him she'd seen him running out the door toward the parking lot. This didn't seem to worry Rick at all.
No, I think this was a normal day for Rick. Just to let the kids run wild.
Yeah, and if I lose one, hell, they'll always come back again.
Yeah, I've got 3 of them.
Yeah, they'll show up.
Then on November 8th, Sue had her first appointment with her new divorce attorney, Christine Tharp. She told the attorney that her husband was mentally unstable and irrational. She felt like her children weren't safe with him because he didn't act safely. She said that Rick had become secretive and often lost his temper with her and the kids. Lately, he'd been out late at night, and neighbors had reported to her that they had seen him driving aimlessly around the neighborhood. So Sue's attorney thought that Sue was in for quite a fight once Rick found out that she was going to get a divorce. At work that afternoon, Sue told her boss, Gary Long, that she was going to get a divorce. She said that she was going to have Rick served in a couple of weeks, but she didn't want him to know about it beforehand. So for the next 2 weeks, Sue and her attorney met and talked on the phone often. Sue was obviously anxious, and Rick's behavior was becoming more and more troublesome. He was forgetting to pick up his sons, and he just seemed preoccupied all the time. Sue was very nervous about how Rick was going to react after he was served with divorce papers. She was also really worried about the $15,000 she was supposed to receive as part of her inheritance from her mother. She didn't want Rick to know about the money because she planned to use it to start a new life with her sons.
Then on November 12th, Sue opened a bank account, and this was in her name only. Sounds like we're starting to get things in place here. She used a friend's address to get statements, took out a cash advance of $7,500 on a credit card to pay her lawyer. That same day, a man named Guy Chapman took his Chevy Suburban to the Texaco gas station that was owned by Richard Clemmer. Remember him?
Yes, he was the one who had been indicted on Sue's grand jury.
He left his keys at the station where Clemmer would sell the vehicle for him. Now, back at the Macfarlane house, Rick accessed Sue's computer and downloaded files. These included a list of property and assets, custody questionnaire, and a journal. So he's figured out now she's planning to divorce him.
Which is very dangerous, turns out.
Could be.
Well, it turns out to be. That Saturday, November 16th, a neighbor named Blanca Hernandez was in her living room when she noticed that Rick was slowly driving up and down the street. He seemed to be staring at her house. When he passed the house at least 7 times, she finally called Sue to see what the hell was going on. The Wells family house across the street from the Macfarlanes was vacant, and it was for sale. Still, one of the Wells family came by the house once a day. At 9 p.m., Rick was seen in front of the Wells house. He was dressed all in white, and he was weed-whacking around their front curb. Now, Rick rarely worked on his own yard, so this was just really out there. But, they were kind of used to Rick being weird.
Well, this is. Besides the fact that he never really worked on his yard, here he is dressed in white.
Yeah.
And he's weed-whacking along the curb.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the next day, the attorney, Christine Tharp, called Sue to talk about the divorce and about evicting Rick from the family home. She wanted the papers served that week. The attorney suggested to Sue that she wait until after Thanksgiving, though, so they decided on Monday after Thanksgiving he would be served. Sue went and had lunch with a girlfriend and told her what was going on and how worried and stressed out she had been. She said she'd been bringing her boys in to sleep with her at night so that Rick couldn't come in there with her.
Probably a good idea.
Yeah, but it also made him more angry, I think.
So Sue made reservations for Rick to visit with his parents over Thanksgiving. She told him that she and the boys were going to Amarillo for the holiday weekend so that he wouldn't want to stay home with them.
Yeah, so Sue planned to stay home and make a Thanksgiving meal for her children and a couple of friends from Houston if Rick went to his parents. But if Rick refused to go to his parents, then Sue would have to go to Amarillo with the boys. Because the thing was, she didn't want to be home with him over the weekend.
Right.
So either she was sending him away or she was going away. She was a very detailed planner. She even reserved a hotel room for Rick to go to after he was served with the divorce papers. She sent an email to her sister Anne detailing her concerns. In the email, Sue wrote that Rick was becoming more secretive and remote each day. She wondered if he was doing some planning of his own. She said she couldn't tolerate 4 days at home with him over the holiday weekend because the tension was just too much to take.
Now, at the vacant house across from the Macfarlane's house, there was a black Labrador retriever who was staying there until the family moved, and he was in the backyard behind a locked gate. So Harriet Wells came by the house daily to feed him and spend some time with him.
Well, yeah, they were just waiting for the fence to be put up at their new house.
Yeah. So at 10 o'clock one night, the dog was found by another neighbor walking down the street. The gate had been left wide open. Now, somebody had to have been on the Wells' property, because the dog's not going to open the gate by himself.
It was impossible.
So the neighbor returned the dog to his yard and latched the gate. Well, it's impossible unless you have a dog like our Hank. He can open doors.
Yeah, this dog couldn't do that.
Yeah, he's not smart like Hank.
No. Well, on the Wednesday of the week before Thanksgiving, so not the day before Thanksgiving, but a week and a day before Thanksgiving, Rick informed Sue that she should feel free to go away for Thanksgiving weekend because he had decided to stay home. So Rick and one of his sons visited Richard Clemmer's Texaco station, and Rick looked at 2 cars that were parked there that had for sale signs. He got the key to a Jeep from Clemmer and took it for a test drive. He returned that 20 minutes later and then took the key to a Suburban. He was gone with the Suburban for 2 hours. When he got back, he told Clemmer that his wife liked the Suburban, but he liked the Jeep. Then he left a fake name and a phone number in Clemmer's message book. He said he was going out of town for a week or so, but he'd be back. Then Sue called a friend in Amarillo and made plans to visit her for Thanksgiving. And she and her girlfriend made plans to hire a babysitter to watch their kids so they could shop together on Black Friday, the Friday after Thanksgiving. Rick called the Texaco and spoke with employee Fernanda Ademez. He said that a friend of his had test-driven the Jeep and it broke down on Austin Highway. He asked him to pass the message on to Clemmer. So the Jeep was actually parked at the gas pumps at a station across from the Texaco, and the Jeep's key fit in the ignition but wouldn't start it. So Ademez pushed the Jeep out of the way and went back to the Texaco. Then Clemmer later had the Jeep moved back to the Texaco. That Friday, November 22nd, Rick stopped at the Texaco again to speak with Clemmer, and he told him about his friend's problem with the Jeep and said that his wife really liked the Suburban. He again said that he would be out of town, but he'd be back on Monday or Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Now Sue and her sons met some neighbors for dinner that Friday, and Sue told them that Rick had spent all the money in their joint bank account, and she had given him a deadline that it had to be returned by. And that Friday night, Rick didn't get home until after midnight and refused to tell Sue where he had been.
Now that Sunday, Sue took the boys to church, and then she gave a birthday party for Margo Cromack at her house that night. Neighbors came to the party, bringing their children. Kids are playing outdoors, jumping on the trampoline, and the adults were inside chatting and enjoying the party. Now, Sue talked to Rick very little at the party, and sometime in the evening, Rick went upstairs to bed. A guest in his 80s was having some chest pain, and an ambulance was called. Now, even with all this commotion going on, Rick never came down from the bedroom. And after most of the guests had gone home, Sue sat with Margo and Doug Cromack, chatting and sipping champagne. Sue was happy with how the party had turned out, and it had given her a nice break from worrying about all her problems that she had with Rick right now.
Sure. Well, she had a dentist appointment on Monday, November 25th, and she went to it and had a crown replaced, and then she headed into work at 8:30 that morning. Fernando Ademez showed up at the Clemmers Texaco at 7 a.m. that day for work. When he had gone home the night before, the Suburban was still there with the for sale sign on it. But that morning it was missing. The whole Suburban, not just the sign. Once at work that day, Sue noticed that someone had deleted the messages that had been left on her voicemail, and she knew it had to be Rick. She called a friend, and after a discussion, she decided that she would stay home for Thanksgiving. Now, she and her friend were concerned that if she tried to leave with the boys for the holiday, Rick might get violent. Things were getting to that point. So she called her sister Anne and told her about Rick's odd behavior. Then she called her niece Kristen and told her about her plans to divorce Rick. When Kristen asked Sue if she was afraid of Rick, Sue said that he might hurt her, but she didn't believe he would ever hurt the kids. So after these calls, Sue got another call, this one from her attorney. They went over their plans. Tuesday, Sue would go to the attorney's office to modify and approve her divorce petition and also a restraining order against Rick.
She left work at 6 p.m. on Monday, stopped at the grocery store on her way home. That night, she helped the boys with their homework and got them ready for bed. Now, as the kids slept, Rick beat his wife to death with a blunt object. Blood splattered the walls and floor. Droplets would be found in the woven wastebasket, the bathroom scale, the closet door, and the door frame.
Well, Sue fought him. Rick's blood was found mixed in with some of hers. And he had injuries on his face and hands. Only Rick, of course, knows for sure what he did next. He may have left her body on a Loveseat that had been in their room near the bathroom's entrance, because the Loveseat was missing the next day. The Macfarlane's Winstar van was missing its carpet the next day also. And in the Ford Explorer that was primarily Sue's car, the floor mats were missing.
At some point, Sue's body had been moved to the Suburban that Rick stole from the Texaco station. DNA testing would prove that it was her blood on one of the floor mats. Some of Sue's hairs were found in the Suburban also.
Yeah, between 1:30 and 2 a.m., the Macfarlanes' next-door neighbors were out walking their dogs, and they saw the white Winstar van in the Macfarlanes' driveway, with all of the rear and side doors wide open, and Rick was out there with the shop vac. Early Tuesday morning, before 7:30 a.m., Rick called Sue's work number. He left a message asking if she had gotten up early that morning and asked her to call him back on his cell. At 7:45 a.m., Margo Cromac's daughter saw Sue's Explorer parked across the street, and Rick was walking away from it.
Margo drove her kids to school that morning and headed for a day trip to Crawford, Texas. As she's on her way, she got a call from Rick Macfarlane, and he asked if she had gotten any messages he'd left for her the night before. He said he had called her at 10:15, very specific here, because he couldn't find where Sue was.
Yeah, so 10:15 Monday night, he said he'd been looking for her.
Yeah, we've got to start getting our alibi set up.
Right, and Rick told Margo that Sue went out and never came back Monday night. So according to him, she had gone out to run some errands, and he told Margo that he had called Sue's work phone, but she hadn't answered, and she hadn't called him back. And he also said that the boys had taken the bus to school. But Margo didn't believe Rick. She was pretty familiar with what a weirdo he was.
Yes, she was.
So she called the school, and she learned that none of the boys were at school that day. So she just guessed that Sue and the boys must have left for Amarillo for the Thanksgiving holiday. They must have left a few days earlier than they had originally planned. But later that morning, Rick took his oldest son to school. They had to stop in the office for a tardy slip, and the receptionist saw that the boy was only wearing one shoe, so the school nurse had to give him a pair of shoes. Of course, they also noticed that Rick had scratches and blood on his face and his ear, and he was wearing gloves on his hands. He told them he fell while he was out running. In the meantime, Sue's friends were calling her cell phone and leaving messages for her. At 10:40 a.m., Rick called her work phone again, and he asked her to call him back as soon as possible. He'd parked his Winstar van in the vacant Wells house driveway across the street, and when a real estate agent arrived that day, he walked over and asked if he needed to move it. She said no, it was okay, he could leave it there. Then minutes later, Harriet Wells arrived at the house, and she thought it was odd that Rick had parked in her driveway, but she knew he was odd and didn't think too much about it. Then Rick reached one of Sue's co-workers at her office on the phone. The woman who answered the phone had not seen Sue, but she said that another employee had seen her. Now this would turn out to be a case of mistaken identity, but Rick seemed pleased or amused because he chuckled when he heard this. Rick called Sue's work phone one more time at 4:15 p.m. and he left another message. Margo called him after that to see if he had talked to Sue. She told him to try talking to her boss to see if she had been at work or if she was still there. At 4 a.m. on Wednesday, November 27th, a neighbor saw Sue's Explorer back out of their driveway and drive away. Now Sue was predictable, going to bed at 9:30 p.m. and waking at 5 a.m., so it was really strange to see her car out that early in the morning. Margo called Rick again on Wednesday, and he was pretending that the boys weren't with him. She asked if he thought that Sue had gone to Amarillo with the boys, and he said he didn't know. Now, even though the boys were at the house with him at this point, so he's definitely lying or misleading her.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, nearby rural Bexar County, a witness took notice of a Suburban and a black SUV that had driven by him more than once. Both of these cars matched the descriptions of the Suburban parked at the Texaco and Sue's Explorer. This witness also saw smoke rising from an abandoned farmhouse.
Right, but he didn't connect these things together, of course.
No.
Later on he would.
Then, late Wednesday night or even early Thursday morning, another Bexar County resident noticed a Suburban parked in front of an abandoned farmhouse. He saw there was a man near the vehicle with a bald head. So this resident thought it could be teenagers up to no good, so he slowed down and opened his window. But what he saw wasn't a teen, but an adult male. He was carrying a dark bag towards the woods. This guy's considering to offer help, but when the man looked at him, he just got the creeps. So he never said anything, just drove away.
So just before 3 a.m. Thanksgiving morning, An officer on patrol noticed a black Ford Explorer parked in an empty lot on Lazy Lane. He parked and looked inside the SUV, which was unlocked with no one inside. The keys were still in the ignition, so he removed them and locked the doors. He called in the plate and found out that it was registered to Richard and Susan McFarland. A police dispatcher called the McFarland house, and Rick answered. He acted surprised and said he didn't know where Lazy Lane was, asked her where it was. Then he said, well, my wife is supposed to be in Amarillo.
So the officer said, oh, I'll wait for you. Come on over, pick up the car. But he said he should just take the keys to the police station, and he picked them up there because he was waiting for a phone call at home.
Yeah, so Rick didn't want to meet the policeman at the car.
No, sirree.
Which was weird. Because shouldn't he be concerned? Why is my wife's SUV parked there? I mean, at this point, he hasn't seen her in 2 days, or 3 days. At least since Monday night, according to him. So early that morning, neighbors heard a circular saw running at the McFarland house. It was possible that Rick was cutting up that Loveseat, if you think about it, because the Loveseat, like I said, was never seen again after that. Rick spoke to one of Sue's friends in Amarillo, and he pretended that he expected Sue to be with them. Now, this is despite everything, so he's just lying. And the kids were with him. Plus, even if all that wasn't true, Sue wouldn't have gone away for Thanksgiving without her sons. So when interviewed by the police, Rick said that Sue was supposed to go to Amarillo on Monday. Not true. But he contradicted himself moments later, saying that Sue told him on Monday that she would be going to Amarillo later that week. Rick said the last time he saw Sue was at 9:30 p.m. on Monday, and he said she left the house to deliver some gifts to friends. He said she never came home after that.
Yeah, so by that story, you've got 3 days elapsed without Rick doing much of anything to try to find Sue.
Well, I'm sure the police were suspicious right away.
Oh, yeah. It's a spouse.
Yeah.
The boys said that they didn't do anything special for Thanksgiving. And when one of their friends visited and played on the trampoline Thursday morning, this kid saw Rick wearing jeans with latex gloves on his hands.
Yeah, and Rick didn't show up at the police station to pick up the Explorer keys until almost 6 p.m. on Thanksgiving Day. That's over 14 hours after they'd called and notified him. And when he did show up, he was wearing new white canvas work gloves and a long-sleeve jacket. He told the police that he had run to Lazy Lane to look for the car, but he hadn't found it. An officer had Rick follow him in the Winstar, where the Explorer was in plain view, so there was no way that he could have run out there to that area and not seen his wife's SUV.
That's right.
So at this point, the officer is getting more suspicious and worried, and he gets a better look inside of that SUV. There was an upholstered chair, a car seat, and a gift basket inside. But there were no obvious signs of a crime. Rick, for his part, refused to approach the car, which was odd. So instead of going over to the car at all, he just told the officer that he had to get home and care for his children, and he left the scene quite quickly.
So the police wanted to come to the McFarlane home in order to talk with Rick and help out in searching for Sue. But Rick insisted he didn't want any police there. He didn't ask if they had any leads about Sue or express any emotion at all. And he agreed to return to the police station that coming Friday. So early Friday morning, the police went to the Cromack house to ask questions. They explained that Sue is missing, and when they heard that the boys were with Rick, they were alarmed. Sue would not have left without them. They were sure that Rick had done something to her.
Yeah, and Margo didn't trust Rick alone with the boys, so she went to the McFarland house right after the police left her house. And Rick was home with his 3 boys. When Rick came to the door, he was wearing gloves on both of his hands. And one of the boys told Margo that Rick had cut his hand. So she asked to see the cut, but he refused to remove his gloves. Also on that day, Rick changed the home voicemail message to say, Rick McFarland's office, instead of the usual family message that was on there. At 10:30 a.m., a patrol officer went back to Lazy Lane to see if the Explorer was still there, and it was. And when he opened the front passenger door, he saw a red spot on the console between the 2 front seats that looked suspicious. It looked like blood, so he called right away to have the SUV impounded.
Then the Explorer was towed to police storage. The officer then went to the McFarlane home, and one of the boys answered the door. When the officer asked him to go get his mother, he said he couldn't do that. She didn't want to be disturbed because she was in a deep sleep.
Yeah, that's pretty creepy.
Yeah, well, and then the officer asked him to get his dad, and the boy said his dad was also asleep and refused to wake him. So the officer left.
Yeah, so it turns out Rick was hiding in the house.
Yeah.
The McFarlanes had a housekeeper who came once a week, and she showed up just before 1 p.m. on Friday. All of the boys were home, but Rick wasn't there. The housekeeper noticed that the house was much neater than usual. Also, a trash can, a VCR, and the Loveseat were missing. Sue normally left a check for the housekeeper on the refrigerator, but there was no check there that day. Rick did go to the police station, and he asked if there could have been a carjacking. But that was preposterous. They said that's not a likely scenario here. Carjackers take the car, not the person.
Right.
They wouldn't park it a few miles away.
Then Rick finally called Sue's sister Ann on Friday, and the first thing he said to Ann was, "Do you know where Sue is?" So Ann's confused, and she didn't know Sue was missing, and she tried to get more information from Rick, but he stammered, said he had to go, and hung up on her.
So that was scary.
So Ann called her other siblings to let them know what seemed to be going on, and then she called Rick's mom, Mona. And she was surprised when Mona said she already knew that Sue had disappeared because she was having an affair.
Yeah, so apparently Rick had already talked to her and told her that Sue was having an affair and had left him for another woman. But the owner of the vacant house across the street, Harriet Wells, dropped by her house across the street that Friday. And she was shocked to find the stolen Suburban parked inside her garage. In order for someone to access that garage, you'd have to get through the gate and the garage to activate the automatic door opener. Some old furniture also would have had to been moved out of the way to pull into the garage. Harriet knew that the McFarlanes didn't have a Suburban, but she still immediately thought of Rick, so that tells you a lot.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So Harriet climbed into the Suburban to search for clues in terms of who had been driving and who left it there. In the back seat, she found a basket with a clear plastic folder. And inside the folder, she found Rick McFarlane's AAA card and a credit card.
So all this weird stuff makes me think there was more than just an evil murderer here. There's a lot of mental illness with this guy.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, he's not right.
So, and Harriet also noticed some other things in her garage that certainly weren't hers. There were 2 gasoline containers, 2 bottles of insecticide, 2 bags of charcoal, a half-empty bottle of cleaner, and a roll of paper towels. Now, the charcoal and gasoline alarmed her, and she thought, wow, he's killed Sue and he's burned her body.
So it tells you a lot that something that heinous would come to her mind so easily.
No kidding.
Right?
They must have had a real good opinion of old Rick.
Right. So Harriet, of course, called the police. And meanwhile, there were other police across the street at the McFarland house knocking on the front door, and no one was answering. But they knew Rick was home, and they continued to watch the house. And once Rick believed the police had left, he emerged from the house wearing bright orange pants and a white t-shirt. He ran to his car and drove away, and police followed him. Then 15 minutes later, Rick returned, pulling back into his driveway, and the police car parked across the street. Rick then went straight into his garage and came out with an extension cord and his circular saw. He plugged it in and started it, and then he cut a line across the pavement of his driveway with the circular saw. Super strange thing to do, right?
Very strange.
But it turns out he was probably trying to remove any DNA from the blade by getting it hot and running through the cement.
Yeah, that's probably a good thought.
Because it seems like he ran back home to destroy evidence because he knew the police were following him.
Definitely.
So super weird.
So, and as police were talking to Harriet in her garage, Rick was nearby pacing back and forth. The undercarriage of the Suburban was covered in mud and vegetation, and on the bumper there was a bloody thumbprint. So the plates on the Suburban didn't match the car. When the owner of the plates was contacted, he said that a man at the Texaco station had offered to drive him to the airport and park his Suburban back at his house for him. So his description matched that of Rick McFarland. So it looks like Rick had taken that man's plates and put them on the other Suburban that was for sale at the Texaco.
Yeah, and did some kind of transporting of the body or something.
Yeah.
I mean, it really shows a lot of wackiness because he's already pulled the carpet out of the Winstar. Why is he involving another vehicle?
Well, there's a couple of things about that. One is he's mentally ill.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's my point here, is that it's really not making a lot of sense.
No.
I mean, he actually used 3 different cars here.
Yeah, he could have simplified it.
Yes. Plus, he's leaving blood.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Wells garage was secured as a crime scene as 2 officers approached Rick and asked him to sign a consent to search his house. And he did agree. He called Margo to pick up the children while the house was being searched. And when they searched the master bedroom and bathroom, investigators right away saw blood droplets on the wall and some other smears that looked like they had been blood. When they searched the Winstar, that's when they noticed that the carpet had all been pulled out.
So then after the boys were taken by Margo to her house, Rick was interviewed in his living room. He had abrasions on his knuckles on his left hand, and a piece of his little finger on his right hand was cut off. Rick said he got the injuries from falling while he was running. He said he ran 2 or 3 times a week, but none of his neighbors knew he was a runner at all. Rick also denied being in the Wells' garage, but then did finally admit to storing some items there because he was cleaning his garage. And also found in the Suburban was a shovel and a multi-tool with blood on it.
So Richard Clemmer, the Texaco owner, said that only one person had ever taken that Suburban for a test drive, and the person had written down his name as Mark Lynn and had left a fake phone number. The name was a fake too, of course. The test driver had been Rick. Now, Sue's brother Pete was a retired homicide detective, and when Ann told him what was going on with Sue and Rick, he knew right away something bad had happened. He said, this just isn't going to turn out well.
No, he's had experience in this stuff.
Yeah.
So while the search of the house is going on, Rick was staying with his boys at Margo Cromac's house. But according to Margo, Rick just wasn't around much. As she cared for his children, he would often disappear for several hours. And he refused to let the boys return to school, saying they needed him. But then he wasn't there with them.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems pretty simple to me that he just didn't want the boys speaking to anyone.
Oh, sure.
At least one of the boys had a pretty good idea of what had happened, unfortunately. And as police searched for Sue, Rick went to see Clemmer at the Texaco station. He told him he wanted to talk to him before the police did. He wanted Clemmer to tell the police that he had given him the keys to the Suburban. Then he wrote down his real name and phone number for Clemmer. But after he left, the page where Rick had written the fake name and number was missing from Clemmer's sign-in book. So Clemmer talked to the police and agreed to let the police record his calls with Rick. He reached Rick on the phone that night, and Rick continued to try and get Clemmer to stick to his story about the Suburban. He also asked Clemmer to sell his Winstar van for him. I think it's a little late to hide that.
Yeah, he's running scared now.
Yeah, he really is.
So Rick hired an attorney, and he stopped saying anything at all to the police. The police did have a warrant for fingerprints and a blood sample, and they took those on December 6th. Sue's sister Ann got Texas EquiSearch to help in the search for Sue, and the director asked Rick to help with the search, but Rick never returned the guy's call. Then the McFarlane boys started to say some odd things, especially the oldest one. He said that the police should give everyone in the world a lie detector test, starting with his father. Rick refused to get the boys any counseling.
No, but Sue's friends and family tried to keep at least the resemblance of a good relationship with Rick so they would continue to have access to the boys. And this wasn't easy because most of them right away thought he had killed Sue.
Well, yeah, it's looking that way.
And Rick was avoiding Sue's family as much as he could, so he was looking very guilty, and he was also avoiding the police and the press. One night a neighbor brought the 2 younger boys home at 9 p.m., and Rick wasn't home like he said he would be. The house was completely dark, but when this neighbor turned on a light, she saw that the house was a complete disaster. Wrappers and papers were everywhere, and nothing had been picked up since the police search. Also, the family cat was locked in a bathroom with a filthy cat box and no food or water. So the neighbor fed the little boys, made them take a bath, and waited with them until Rick got home. Later, she called CPS to report the neglect. And interviews with the boys would reveal that Rick would hit them and pull their hair as punishment for bad behavior, so they were afraid of their dad.
Well, they certainly were, with good reason. On January 14th, searchers got a new lead and went to the San Antonio River. Now, they followed the river's edge until they found what looked like a fresh burial site. Forensics team was brought in, and they meticulously excavated. As they got closer to the body, they could smell the aroma of death, but it ended up to be a grave for a dog and not a human.
Right. But that same afternoon, following another lead, they went to a parcel of land with an abandoned farmhouse on it. That's where the smoke was seen, and it would turn out where Rick had been parked with a black bag when that other guy drove by.
So this is where they found Sue's body.
Yes, burnt. And once the children were determined to be safe with a neighbor, Rick was arrested. As soon as he was put in a cell, he requested protective custody, and it was granted. Sue's body was found hidden in a trailer on the farmhouse property. The charged shell of a VCR was found with her remains, as well as some coiled springs, which probably came from the missing Loveseat. Botanical samples from the area would match the samples from beneath the Suburban. So Sue's remains, of course, were severely damaged by the fire, but there were no tool marks to indicate that she had been dismembered. A large fracture to the left side of her head appeared to be the cause of death, but she also had fractured ribs and fractured vertebrae.
So Rick's bail was set at $950,000, and there were 4 charges: murder, unauthorized use of a vehicle, attempting to bribe a witness, and tampering with evidence. The defense requested a bail reduction of $100,000. The judge did lower the bail to $550,000. Rick's parents were retired, and they could only come up with $30,000.
Yeah, so now there's the issue of the children. Rick tried to convince his brother David and his wife to take custody of his boys, but David refused. So that whole family, they kind of seem like jerks, from what I've read.
Jerks might be a little strong, but they are dysfunctional.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other 2 brothers were basically letting their wives support them as well. But I don't know if they were as dysfunctional as Rick.
Yeah, that takes some doing.
Yeah, but Rick's 2 younger boys were placed in foster care, and the oldest boy had to be put in a facility with programs that were specialized for counseling traumatized children. So that boy actually had seen and knew some things. Just so sad.
Rick's parents were not physically capable of raising their grandchildren. And there was a big age difference between Sue and her other siblings, so they all felt they were well beyond the age to raise young children. Our sister Ann was willing to adopt one of the boys. They wanted the children to end up with family and stay in their lives.
Yeah, and Rick's parents were working with their bank to try and come up with bail money, but they found out that Rick had taken over $60,000 from their home equity account. But Rick blamed it on Sue, and they took Rick's side. They believed him. So while in jail, Rick's father died of natural causes, and Rick wasn't well liked by his fellow prisoners, so several of his roommates requested a change, and Rick incurred several violations for contraband, including silly things like candy.
And as they prepared for trial, prosecution considered that the defense team might try and claim Sue was killed in self-defense or by accident, but they believed that this stolen Suburban would squash those arguments. Then there's also the electronic evidence from Rick hacking into Sue's computer and the blood evidence. They would not have any of the McFarlane children take the stand because they didn't want to traumatize them any more than they'd already been.
Yeah, well, that seems like the sensible thing. The poor kids. I mean, who knows what they went through that week? It's just hard to imagine. Terrible. The one boy said Mom's in a deep sleep, so what does that tell you? That he might have seen his mother dead, right?
Might have seen the dead mom, yeah.
Oh, my God. Well, before jury selection was done, a plea agreement was announced to the court. In the deal, Rick McFarland waived his right to a jury trial on the murder charge, and the other charges were dropped. But he lost custody of his children and accepted a sentence of 40 years, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. So to me, I mean, that's a heavy sentence, but it's kind of light considering what he did.
Yeah, I think so.
The children continued in therapy, and they learned that their dad had admitted to killing their mom. So that had to be really hard for them to accept. I don't know how you live with that. Their father's parental rights would be terminated officially that April. A married cousin of Sue's who lived in Georgia agreed to adopt the 2 older McFarlane boys. But just 2 weeks after the boys arrived at their house, they changed their minds. Sue's sister Ann begged them to keep the boys, because they hadn't even had time to adjust, right? It's only been 2 weeks.
I know.
But they declined. So I think that's kind of shitty. I mean, I know raising kids isn't easy, but I feel like if one of my sisters died and they had young kids, I would just take those kids. I wouldn't question it.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
And even if there's some hesitation, 2 weeks is way too soon to make any firm decision on that.
Right. I agree. I think that's shitty.
Well, it doesn't seem like it was a very good family.
So maybe in the long run it's better they didn't end up with those people.
Probably.
Because in 2005, the original foster parents adopted the 2 younger boys. The oldest boy, who'd been in the institution and probably knew what his father did to his mother, he was eventually adopted by a single middle-aged woman who was educated in child development and child welfare. And they thought this was a good fit for him because there wouldn't be any other kids in the house and she could really give him the one-on-one attention and he could get intensive therapy. So I hope he was successful in that.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how these kids are turning out.
Right, but I have to give credit to the people who did adopt them. They weren't even family.
No.
When family members didn't, and who am I to judge? But I just can't imagine turning away kids that are in my family. So we really don't know what made Rick McFarland into the man who stole the mother from his 3 sons. But his parents did defend him, and they seemed eager to blame Sue for everything. So there is that. I mean, it's a little bit of the whole golden boy syndrome we've talked about.
That's right.
That my son can do no wrong, and then they end up doing a lot of wrong.
And you know, you've mentioned this before, but this is a situation that's not unheard of. We know that the most dangerous time for an abused woman in terms of physical harm is when she decides to either leave her partner or becomes pregnant.
Yes, absolutely. Well, for more information on this case, I really would recommend that you read a book called Gone Forever. It's written by Diane Fanning, who's written quite a few true crime books. We've probably read some of them. I can't remember which ones. But she's a great true crime author. And most of our information about the lives of the McFarlands came from her book. Now, there's also an ID show about this case, Blood Lies and Alibis, A Deadly Disappearance. But that's it. There's not a ton out there. There might be a Wikipedia, little things like that, but not a lot out there on the case. I'm surprised. It did get a fair amount of media coverage when it happened, but really nothing since. The True Crime Brewery music was written and produced by Tristan Capel. And this is the part of the show where I usually try and sell you a Team Tie Grabber membership. But today I'm just going to wish you all a Happy New Year. I hope that you'll find love and kindness in 2020. And there's no feedback today because it's a holiday and we're running a little long. But please keep sending in your comments, your suggestions, and your voicemails. We'll be sharing more in 2 weeks. We're off next week for a holiday, and then we'll be back to our weekly schedule the following week.
So, down from the quiet end, everyone have a Happy New Year.
That's right. We might as well hang out here.
Yep.
And wait for midnight.
Might as well.
Okay.
All right.
We'll see you next time at the quiet end.
The quiet end. We'll be there.
Bye-bye.
Bye.